Jessica is a China scholar. She focuses on the politics behind policy diffusion, particularly policy experimentation, and the way it plays out in this huge emerging giant. She's interested in policy experimentation in the context of civil society. For her talk today, she will use the example of in-home elder care programs to discuss the successes and failures of policy experimentation. But what is policy experimentation? Do the majority of people who benefit from it? Is there a process of negotiation that takes place between government and local officials and civil society at both the experimentation and the implementation stage? How willingly does civil society accept the new policies? Do people have to be coerced? If they don't like it, can they demonstrate? How, when, and why do experimental policies get diffused from one local area to another? And what are the social, economic, and political costs associated with policy experimentation? While Professor Teets will discuss some of these issues in the context of China, policy experimentation is not unique to China and can be found in other emerging economies as well. But does authoritarianism make the implementation of policy experimentation a sure success? We'll find out. So, what is policy experimentation? Not all of us here are political scientists, so I'm just going to go through it and quickly explain what I think it is, and maybe I'll be corrected. It is a way for a political regime to try bold and sometimes new ideas that prioritize certain sectors of the economy or society which previously failed or were neglected. These experimental policies often replace policies that are stagnant, too expensive, and even risky, and are seen often as real innovations. They are methodically selected and tried with the hope that if successful, they will become part of the official policy making and will be implemented at a wider geographical scale. Simply put, policy experimentation is a way to introduce intervention into existing policies in order to bring more efficient transformative change, regardless of political environment. Observers suggest that of all emerging economies, China has been the most successful in using policy experimentation as a way to transform, even revolutionize, the social and economic landscape of the country. The policy transformation had to be particularly bold because of the inertia that was inherited in the old ideologically loaded political and economic regime. The Chinese experience with its succession of policy experiments at local and regional level may have been, as some scholars argue, responsible for the economic miracle in China. But clearly, not all experimental policies have succeeded. Professor Teets will examine the politics behind policy experimentation and explain why some of these policies succeed while others do not. Her case is, as I said, in-home elder care programs. Professor Teets is the author of Civil Society Under Authoritarianism, the China Model, which was published this year by Cambridge University Press, and she's also the co-editor of a volume called Local Governance, Innovation in China, Experimentation, Diffusion, and Defiance, which was also published this year. She's very active. In addition, her articles have appeared in top journals in the field of China studies. And she is our resident Chinese and China politics colleague, and I want to welcome her to the podium, and I ask you to join me, please.
Thank you all for joining me today. I know it's a miserable day to be outside and walking around, so for those of you whose offices aren't in this building, thank you. And Timmy gave a great definition, actually, of policy experimentation. So this is exactly what we're going to be looking at today, is this process of finding a policy either in an area that needs a policy that didn't have one, or in an area where maybe a policy has failed. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to try to stay near the microphone, but if you can't hear me, let me know. So I wanted to start with the big picture. We'll go very, very narrow in a minute and look at a specific case in a specific country. But more broadly, when we think about how policies are formed in countries, usually, especially as political scientists, we tend to look from the top down. So in the United States, if we say, how do we have a new healthcare system? We're looking primarily at the executive. We're also looking at the legislature. And if we're looking at outside sources of this change, oftentimes we're looking at lobbyists, right? And so if you ask most people how policy is changing in the United States, you're going to get a top-down story, right? Especially from political scientists. But we have these confounding cases too, where we see that policy change is actually driven from the bottom. So through social movements, like this is the protest that happened in New York City just a few months ago over climate change. And these are pictures from Tunisia where they wanted a change in governing regime, right? So they wanted democratic policies to be adopted as part of the Arab Spring protests. And so we have these cases then where we see that policy is changed from the bottom up. But we don't really have a good way of understanding how this happens, especially as part of normal politics. And so what I'd like to look at is the case of China, because China's a really hard case to examine bottom-up policy change, right? So China is a single-party authoritarian system, which means that in its constitution and other governing documents, policy change can only come from the very top, more specifically from 7 men. Right? So if you want to understand why we see policy change in China, usually it's being decided by 1 or 2, maybe as many as 7 people. And that's how we see policy change. We don't see a lot of social protest. Again, this is a single-party authoritarian state. So every social protest is seen as a Trojan horse of democracy. Right? So every time you see a group of people protesting in the street, even if they're protesting over something like the environment, it's seen as a veiled threat to the administration that they want to overthrow the system and install a democratic system, right? China has a very strong and effective military as well as a very strong and effective internal security apparatus. So we don't see a lot of protest in China that's sustained and that's really focused on changing policy. When we do see protests in China, it's usually about smaller local issues, and these protests usually stop as soon as the local government agrees to meet with the protesters. So when we think about China, really we're looking at a system where we should understand policy as coming from the top down. But I want to look at a lot of cases that I'm seeing that are where policy has changed at the national level from below, right? So these are some hard cases to understand. Now, one of the most famous cases that probably most of you have heard of are the special economic zones that were established under Deng Xiaoping. So these experimental policies basically picked these cities along the coast, and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to practice or try out capitalism. We don't want to establish it across the whole country yet because we don't know what the impact will be. Plus, this is a large-scale political and economic change. So what we'll do is we'll experiment with policies of capitalism, like foreign direct investment, and we will see how that works, and then we will cherry pick the best examples of these experimental policies, and these will become national policy, right? So this is a really famous example of how experimental policy that starts at the local level in China, in the Chinese provinces, can change the national system. But there are also many, many more cases. So for example, the picture that I have next to the map of the special economic zones, this is a picture taken from an award ceremony that's held by a Chinese government agency that's picking local governance innovations. They have an award ceremony each year, and on average, they usually receive about 200 nominations of local government innovations. And these are in lots of different areas, and I'll go through some more cases. But we see economic innovations like establishing high-tech parks. We see political innovations like expanding democracy, how many people you can vote for directly in the Chinese polity. We also see a lot of social experimentation, and that's one of the policies we're going to talk about today, which is how do you take care of the elderly. So in China, we do see that there are some famous examples, but there are also a lot of everyday examples where policy change that started at the provincial level in China bubbles up and becomes national level policy. And what I find so intriguing about this is that this is not how the system is supposed to work, right? So this is happening counter to the way that the Constitution is written in China, which is a single-party authoritarian state where the 7 members of the Politburo are supposed to be making decisions for the country. The reason that I find this to be really intriguing is if we look at this quote from Machiavelli, one of the most famous political scientists, he points out that it's very difficult to change the existing structure. It's difficult, first of all, because there are a lot of political interests that are arrayed against you. So if you want to change something, you're changing something where you have a group of people who won under the old system, but might be losers under the new system, right? So they're bound to oppose you. Also, we see that especially when you're thinking about political change in an authoritarian system that's a single party, so China is the largest bureaucracy on earth, right? Everybody in the Chinese system is a bureaucrat. And we tend to think about bureaucrats as not being particularly innovative, right? So the last time you were probably at the Department of Motor Vehicles, waiting in line to get your license, you didn't see somebody behind the counter saying, wow, these people look angry. I think I'm going to try to change something and see if there's some innovation I can do to make sure that people have a better experience with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when we talk about bureaucrats, what we're thinking about is the fact that they have no incentive to try to change the system, right? They're merely a cog in the machinery. So in China, think about this on a grand scale, right? Everybody's a bureaucrat. And the problem for Chinese officials is that they really don't have much of an incentive to try to change things, even things that are obviously broken. And this is for 2 reasons. One is because policy change is incredibly uncertain. So you can implement a policy change, but you don't know how long it will be before you see any sort of impact. So what we find from our studies of local government officials in China is on average they have a tenure of less than 3 years, to be exact 2.7 years, which means that at the start of your term, if you were to institute a policy innovation, would you be able to see any sort of meaningful change in that 2.7 years, right? So that's uncertain. So if it's going to be something that's difficult to implement, maybe politically costly to implement, is this really the way that you want to spend your time, right? Now the other reason that we might see that there aren't incentives to innovate is that it's incredibly risky. So first of all, what sort of constellation of political and economic interests might you anchor, right? So you might be taking power away from certain people to give it to other people. So that's inherently risky if you're a bureaucrat. The other thing is that we don't know whether these innovations will be successful or not. I mean, that's the whole idea of a policy experiment is you have to see what happens. So policy is really complex and it links to so many different things. We don't have simply political innovation or economic innovation. Even if we think about the special economic zones, we're seeing that these have both political and economic ramifications, right? And so this makes innovation inherently risky. You don't know what the outcome is. It might have no outcome, it might be positive, it might be negative. You might not see that outcome in a certain period of time, but you also might anger key constituencies that matter for your career. So all in all, what we should expect in China is not to see a lot of innovation, right? So every government official is a bureaucrat and they don't have any real incentive for innovating or experimenting. And so this is the puzzle that I try to look at in my research, which is why do we see over 200 nominations each year for all these different types of political innovations if there really isn't an incentive for this? We must be missing part of the story, right? And the reason that this is so important, in China especially, is that in an authoritarian system, we don't have a lot of ways for that system to change itself. So let's say that something is going horribly wrong in some part of China. If you're an authoritarian system where all of the decisions are being made in the capital city, they might not know that something's going horribly wrong, and even if they know about it, it might be difficult to change, right, in one specific area. And so what's really fascinating about this idea of bottom-up policy change is it creates the kind of adaptability inside of a single-party authoritarian system that isn't built into the governing institutions, right? So there's no way, according to the Chinese constitution, for local citizens, NGOs, businesses, for any of these societal actors to play a role in policy. But experimental policy creates this opening and this feedback mechanism to tell the party which policies are working and where, right? Which ones need to be reformed. And so the reason that I think that this is so exciting, especially to study in an authoritarian context, is that it really represents a way to see change in the Chinese system, reform rather than revolution, right? So in China, there's a long literature that looks at this with economic reform, and they focus on this phrase, which is crossing the river by feeling for stones. And the way that economic reform and the China miracle more broadly is talked about in this literature is that basically what the Chinese leadership did well is rather than doing some sort of shock therapy and trying to change the Chinese system overnight, what they did instead is they used experimental policies to shift policy, to see what happened with those experimental policies, and then to pick the best experiments and then use that as national level policy. This gave them a chance to stop at each step in the process, see what was working and what wasn't, and recalibrate, right? So that's the idea behind successful economic reform in China. But also we can think about this politically, right? So not just economically, but if you're a single party authoritarian system, there are all sorts of challenges to your political control. So how do we manage those in the largest bureaucracy on earth? And so the way that we manage this might be that experimental policy allows NGOs, it allows civil society, it allows societal actors in different areas to play a role in policy that otherwise they would be held out of. So you can take people who are upset over certain government policies and bring them into the political process in a way that you can't under the formal institutions, right? So this is really exciting, is that what we might be seeing is the creation of an informal, bottom-up policy-making system in China. So that's what I find so interesting about this, and the reason that I think we should care so much about what's happening in China with experimental policy making is that really this represents a way for China to change without having revolution. Now, even for those of us who might not prefer the political system that we currently have in China, we know that revolutions are inherently dangerous, right? People lose their lives, they lose their livelihoods. We know from economic development that revolution and civil war put economies back decades. And so we might prefer to see a system where we can see some sort of peaceful evolution and political change through peaceful reform rather than through revolution or civil war, right? So this could be really important for the future of China. So let's try to understand then, why do we see this policy experimentation in China? Because again, as I've explained to you, on paper at least, we can't find any incentives that would explain why we see so much policy experimentation in China. So one of the most common arguments is this idea of experimentation under hierarchy. And basically what this explanation argues is that there are reformers inside of the central government, right? So one of those 7 men whose pictures we looked at in the Politburo, that some of those people are reformers, and they would prefer to see that policies change in different ways. But they can't necessarily just change the policy because they have people who oppose that change. So instead what they do is they send a signal, some sort of informal conversation, to local government officials at the provincial level, and they say, hey, I'd really like to see that this policy changes. Why don't you create a pilot program, an experimental policy, and when it's successful, I can champion it, and all the people who would otherwise oppose me will have to admit empirically that this is successful, right? So this is a way for reformers inside of the central government to try to change policy, okay? And so what this means then, if we try to understand policy experimentation in China, is that we should understand policy experimentation, even though it looks like it's being driven from the bottom up, as still coming from the top down, right? So the central government is initiating it, and then it's selecting the reforms that it likes. So even though it might look decentralized, it is in fact completely centralized, okay? The second explanation, and we're seeing more and more people writing about this now, is that the reason that we see so much policy experimentation in China is that there are certain places in China where it's just ungovernable. And so the people who are arguing this, they point to certain places in China where, because of government intervention or because of separatist movements or different types of politics, you see that certain areas just simply aren't able to be governed. So one of the more intriguing case studies happened in Sichuan province, where the local government was seizing land illegally from the peasants. And the peasants were arming themselves and fighting pitched battles with local government to protect their land. This is basically a situation where, regardless of what the government policy is, local people were not going to follow it, right? So in that situation, what you saw is that the provincial governor said, you know what? You think that we're doing a bad job by picking local government officials, they're stealing your land, so you pick your leaders, you vote for your leaders, and make your leaders run your town. And so basically what she did is she dramatically increased the number of positions that people could vote for inside of China. So rather than the governor appointing the mayor of this town, she said, let's hold an election, and you put your people in here. And so what they did is they took the leaders of the protest and they elected them into these positions. So now the mayor was not a party member, the mayor was now the person who had organized the land protests. So we see lots of examples like that in China where simply because of local need, the fact that these areas are ungovernable, you see experimentation. So it's not being driven by the center. In fact, in this instance, the central government said, wait a second, we don't want to see the expansion of democracy to the mayoral level, maybe the governor level, right? We don't want to see that. And they insisted that the government in Sichuan stop doing this, and the government in Sichuan ignored them. They said, we have to do this in order to govern, right? So this is an example of how policy may come from the bottom up in response to local needs, that the central government is not controlling, and in fact, when the central government tries to control it, is being rebuffed, okay? So those are two explanations that we see about why we might see so much policy experimentation in China. And I think that we see enough cases that correspond to both of these explanations to say that, yes, these explanations are telling us something about some of the cases that we see. But we also see a lot of cases that don't really fit into either of these profiles. So we see cases where the central government is not coordinating any sort of policy experimentation. In fact, cases where they've explicitly said, please don't experiment in this area. This area is a no-go zone. We don't want you experimenting here. We still see experimentation. And we also see a lot of experimentation that's happening in areas that are well-governed. Places like Shanghai, right? So Shanghai has some of the highest rates of policy experimentation in China, and Shanghai is clearly not ungovernable, right? And so what I was trying to think about then is, well, what is an explanation that would provide some sort of insight into why we see this experimentation in all of these other cases? And what I argue is happening is I argue that local officials are learning. And what I mean by this is that in order for local officials in China to get promoted, what normally happens is that, let's say that somebody starts at the township level, the lowest level of government in China. So this is sort of like a city council, right? So you're elected to the city council. At this point, now you have to be promoted by being selected by your supervisors and moved to the next level of government. The way that this happens is that if you're doing a good job, the next level of government will select you, and you'll slowly make your way up through the system. Once you reach the top level of government in your province, then you'll start being rotated out to other provinces. Now, if you look really promising, what they'll do is they'll send you to areas that are hard to govern, to really train you and test your mettle. And so you'll be sent to places like Tibet and Xinjiang to see how you do with areas that have a lot of social protest. You'll also be sent to areas like the northeastern part of China, the Rust Belt of China. How do you change a post-industrial economy and make it grow? And so there are a lot of articles, Eric Lee and a number of other people have written about this meritocracy in China, that if you want to make it to be on that stage with the 7 top officials in China, You have to go through this system. You have to spend your career going from one position to the next, improving yourself, right? The problem is this is slow, very, very slow. And in China, there's a mandatory retirement age for government officials. If you're in the top leadership ranks, it's the age of 70, which technically means, since there are 5-year terms, that once you hit the age of 67, you're done. You can't be promoted again, right? So if this process takes too long for you to get into the central committee, where the Politburo is chosen out of, it means that you already know the end of your career. So usually by the time you're in your early 50s, you know the ending to your career. For the next 20 years, you're just sort of coasting, right? So what this does is this sets up an incentive system where if you want to get to those top positions in China, you have to speed up your promotion clock. And what I argue is that the only way to really do this is through innovation. So if you merely are, let me think of a nice way to say this, if you merely are giving really nice presents to your supervisor, right, so alcohol and cigarettes, what will happen is you will get promoted, but not quickly, because everyone is doing that. If you just do a good job, if you just show merit, you'll also get promoted, but you're going to go on that long and circuitous track that I talked about, right? So both of those ways of getting promoted will advance you, but not to the top levels. The only way that we've ever seen that people can jump the queue, so to speak, or get themselves promoted at a faster rate is if they come up with a really innovative solution to a problem in Chinese governance. So these are people who developed land reform policies, like Zhao Ziyang, who reformed land in China and then became the general secretary of the party. So we have these instances where people are dramatically able to speed up their clocks. So rather than going through all of those positions, they immediately get promoted to the central government. Now, if that happens to you, you hold out the chance of being the president of China, right? And so what I argue is that local government officials, while this is clearly not something that they're being told is part of their career incentive package, they're learning from watching other people's trajectory that this is the way to accelerate your promotion clock. And if you want to hold top office in China, you have to accelerate your promotion clock. And the way that they're learning about these things is, first of all, the way that cadres have a scorecard, and the scorecard is used to rank them each year, sort of like your grades, right? Except that, unfortunately for these local government officials, they have over 100 categories in which they have to show progress. Underneath those big 100 categories are thousands of sub-bullets. So when you're a cadre and you're looking at your scorecard and you're saying, okay, I want to get promoted quickly, how do I do it? That scorecard doesn't really give you much of an indication of how to do it. But what we're starting to see is that there have been an update to these scorecards around innovation, especially innovation around environmental degradation. And so increasingly what we're seeing in China is that cadres are reading that cue and saying, they just added this to the scorecard, this must be the priority. So if I show innovation in these areas, it doesn't matter how I'm performing in these other areas, I can get promoted really quickly. Also, we see that local government officials are embedded in networks of government officials. And so they exchange information with one another. Now they do this in ways that we would talk about more in political science, as far as being embedded in a party membership network. So you're all members of the party and you have retreats, and this is where you would share information. Also, government officials are required to take what we could call sort of continuing education classes through the local party schools. So they're taking classes together and having retreats, and they're exchanging information. There's also emulation campaigns, and this is where different levels of government say you should be like X official, and they tell you how this official has done so well. But really what happens, and this is not so much of an official political science causal mechanism, is gossip, right? So this is really what's driving this change, is that local government officials, when they're meeting with one another, are saying, hey, did you see that this guy got promoted really, really quickly, only 3 years in his position, and now he's at the central government? How did he do it? And they're sharing information in that way about what sort of innovation this person came up with and how they marketed that innovation to higher levels of government. And we see a really interesting case study that Suchi May and Margaret Pearson recently did in my book, so I had to read it. That's how you stay abreast of cutting-edge research. And what they found is that they looked at a case where they found that local government officials were told to reduce the amounts of steel that they were producing in their state-owned enterprises because there was too much on the open market. And the US was angry about this. This was under President Bush, for those of you who remember this. And so what happened is, for local government officials, they said, there's a really big incentive here. If everyone else reduces their steel exports and I increase mine, I get a huge payoff, right? So the incentive here is to increase your steel while everyone else is decreasing it. But the central government said, if you do that and we catch you, you will have stiff penalties. You will lose your position. And a few people, 2 people in fact, did lose their position because they were increasing their steel output when they were supposed to be decreasing it. That didn't stop anyone. So ultimately the policy failed because every single local government official said, well, they can't stop all of us and there's huge benefit to us for disregarding what they're saying, so we should all do it. And they all did it. Right? And so we also see that these strategies are around innovation, but they're also around defiance, which is that innovation might win for you, even if the central government says that it won't. Ultimately, except for 2 officials, all of these officials were quickly promoted because they showed great economic development in their areas. Right? So this is the incentive system. And so what I'm arguing is that even though we can't understand it from the formal incentive structure that we see local government officials facing in China, informally, there is a really large incentive for them to experiment. And even more than being the first one to adopt something, you really get a payoff if you're number 2 or 3. Right? And the reason for this is that the risk and uncertainty go dramatically down when somebody else has already implemented it. You can see how long does it take for there to be results. You can also see what are the results and did this person get promoted. And so what I would argue is that we should expect not only to see policy innovation and experimentation, but we should expect to see that those successful examples are rapidly picked up and rolled out to all provinces before the central government even has time to act. So this is what I'm arguing is a completely bottom-up driven process, and that the central government is basically just trying to stay on top of this wave, right, and balance on top of it. And they actually have very little control over this process. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at a particular case study. And so this case study is looking at a social policy that is in-home elder care. And what in-home elder care is basically you deliver care inside of the home. So rather than sending people once they reach the age of 65, which is what we count as elderly in China, once you reach the age of 65, rather than being sent to a nursing home where it's sort of one size fits all, right? Even if you're capable of living on your own and you just need help with maybe groceries or something like that, everybody is treated as if they're disabled and they need nursing home care. So rather than doing that policy, what in-home elder care says is that we should target our treatments to the population. So we might have different services that we could deliver. Services where we simply make sure that people are getting the right medications each day. They have the twice-a-week bathing service to help the elderly bathe, because this is a period of time that research has found that a lot of people fall and break their hips, which then does mean that they have to go into nursing home care. And we also see a lot of other plans that are involved with making sure that the elderly have good, healthy food to eat, helping them prepare that food, as well as giving them chances to socialize, right? And so the way this model has evolved is that care is delivered in-home, but then there are also community centers that the elderly can go to for social and other experiences. So the way that this happened, the way that this policy happened, is that China was facing a change in their demographics. So for a long time, the population pyramid in China looked like a pyramid. So you had the elderly at top, but you had a huge working class population. And so the way that care was given to the elderly in China was around a traditional model of family-delivered care. So as you aged, your family started providing care for you, right? Well, what's happened in China with the one-child policy is that that pyramid has inverted in a very short period of time. So now what we see is that the largest population is actually age 55 and above, and the smallest population are the youngest, leaving a very small working age population. So effectively what this means for each person who's working in China, they're supporting 2 parents and 4 grandparents. So if you think about your own budgets and how that would work, that is something that just can't continue, right? And as this demographic shift continues to happen, so as the elderly, which are right now in this bulge period between 55 to 65, as they continue to age, this is going to become even more difficult. The problem for China is that they don't have a comprehensive system such as Social Security or Medicare. And if you think about the population in China, you can't have something that's comprehensive, right? So if we in the United States, with our small population, are worried about paying for Medicare in the future, think about China, right? So this would be the largest entitlement program in the world. So what China's facing right now is they know that they need to adopt state policies, but it's not economically practical for them to adopt the examples that they currently have, right? Germany, the US. So they have to innovate, they have to create their own. And so what we see then is that places like Shanghai, so if you look at the population at the bottom, you can see that right now Shanghai's population is at about 28% of their total population is age 65 and above, or sorry, 60 and above. And by 2015, so by next year, this will have reached 30. And these numbers were estimates, but actually you see that this is much higher. It's going to be closer to 38% because there's also migration into Shanghai. So if you think about 38% of your population needing some sort of elder care, but you're still a developing nation, right, with a high rate of poverty, how do you provide that care? So originally what Shanghai did, so they had access to all of these figures, right? They knew what was happening. And they knew that China was aging at one of the highest rates we've ever seen in the world outside of Japan. But unlike Japan, they're poor. Their per capita income is much, much lower than Japan. So in Shanghai, when they looked at this statistic, they said, okay, we need to get in front of this, we need to adopt policies. And they started building as many nursing homes as they can. A decade later, they could serve less than 3% of the current elderly population. So they realized they couldn't just use nursing homes. So at that point, one of the NGOs that I have dealt with in Shanghai that was also doing migrant education programs, they created a program that delivered in-home elder care. This is the twice-a-week bathing program and taking the medicines. And what they did is they went to the Shanghai government and they said, why don't you pay us to deliver these programs and we'll deliver it to a certain area in China as a policy experiment and we can see if it works. And it was tremendously successful because since each person didn't need the same level of care, they could take the same budget that they were using for the nursing homes, but provide up to, I think they covered about 92% of the population in that area with the same amount of money. That was starting 3%. So it was an incredibly effective program, and this started in Shanghai in 2000, but by 2013, every province other than Tibet has adopted it. So what I'm going to look at is why. So the first thing that I looked at when I tried to figure this out is I put together a database where I took every single mention of this particular policy and its adoption date. And so I plotted this for all provinces across China, and you can see, of course, Shanghai being number one down here, and this is just the adoption rate, right? So what we're seeing are new cases, not the existing cases. So by 2013, even though it looks like there were only 4 new adopters, essentially this is every province in China has now adopted it by 2013 except for Tibet, okay? So when we look at these new cases, what I was trying to figure out is the central government driving this process? So are these provinces adopting this policy because the central government is telling them to do so? So here are the 2 points, 2006 and 2012, when the central government said to the provinces, you really need to come up with some sort of non-nursing home elder care. But what we can see is that we already had a rapid process of adoption at that point. So by the time that the central government said you should adopt it, close to half of the provinces had already adopted it. Then again in 2012, when they said, hey, you really need to adopt it, all but 4 provinces had already adopted it. So we don't see a lot of evidence here that the central government is playing much of a role. So what about this idea of ungovernability, right? Responding to local need. So this is, I had to teach myself how to do GIS for this project, as well as some other statistical methods. So this project took a long time. But basically what you're looking at is a GIS map from the Harvard Maps project. And this has an overlay on it of the percentage of the population that is at different age points. And so we're looking at 60 and above here. Now, the darker the shade of pink, the higher the concentration, right? So you can see Shanghai. So if we look over here at Shanghai, you're seeing that it's a really dark pink color, right? That 38% that we talked about. Well, if we plot on top of it, if we plot on top of it the cities, see these blue circles? These are the first adopters. What we see is that they are in these brighter pink areas, right? And I'll give you statistical results in a second. But what we're seeing, and the reason that GIS was so helpful for this analysis, is that while there is some level of need, these aren't the cases that have the highest levels of need, other than Shanghai. So on average, we see that these early adopters have about 12% of their population age 60 and above. Late adopters have about an average of 6%. So there is a difference here. It is that local governments are responding to need, but the areas that we would think as being ungovernable because they have such a large proportion of elderly were not the early adopters. Most of those adopted after 2011. So what I argue is driving this is that there is a response to local need, but that's not the real reason that people are innovating. Instead, they're innovating because they want to get promoted, and this is a hot button issue right now. And if you could find, whatever the next solution is going to be that's adopted at the central government level, this is your ticket to success, right? You can be the next Xi Jinping, you can be the next president. And so the way that I tried to test this was using a Cox hazard model. And the reason that I used this methodology is this is what's used in epidemiology. So if you want to show, for example, how a population might get cancer again, right? So they've already been treated, they're in remission. What's the likelihood of each factor that they're going to have cancer again? And the reason that this is helpful, I know that sounds really horrible, doesn't it? But the reason that this is helpful in studying policy adoption is it weighs each one of these variables each year until they adopt it. And so I can see then what the weight of each one of these variables is in having the local government decide to adopt this policy. And so what I did was I tested, using a dummy, I tested the central government saying, you need to adopt this, and it's not significant. I also tested the percentage of the elderly as a percentage of the total population, and that is significant. What's also significant, though, is my argument, which is that local government officials are adopting this policy because they're learning from neighboring provinces how successful it is. And the way that I tested this was as each province around you adopted this policy, the score that I was using would go up. So what this meant is that over time, if all of your neighboring provinces were adopting this policy, were you also more likely to adopt it versus a province who maybe had one neighbor who adopted it. And so, and the reason that I did this is just a side note, but the reason that I did this is in China, we still don't see a national media system, we see regional media systems. So if we think that people are exchanging information either in person or through the press, this has got to be done inside of regions, right? We don't see national systems, and people's party networks are also regional party networks. So this is why I looked at neighboring provinces. And what I found is that the more neighbors surrounding you that adopted this policy, the greater your likelihood was of adopting the same policy. So what I've done now is I've basically been able to show that there is this learning process that's occurring and that it is important to explain innovation. But I'm only looking at one policy. So I don't know, is this policy unique for some reason, right? Everybody loves the elderly. Who can say no to a policy reform about the elderly? So what I'm going to do also is I'm going to expand and look at other areas, including difficult areas like political reform. So what I'm coding right now is this idea of inter-party democracy, meaning that I'm trying to look at how government officials, rather than being appointed, are starting to be elected, right? So this is a major reform in the Chinese political system. So if you're an authoritarian government, you don't usually have elections, right? And so what we're looking at in China is the expansion of elections. And so I'm trying to understand if this learning process can explain this as well. And so the way that I'm coding this now is looking at unrest. This is my ungovernability index, looking also at the central signals, and then using the same measure of trying to look at neighboring provinces. And so this is where I am right now in the process. And I've also recently put in for a 7-year grant that would allow myself plus a team of 3 other researchers to go and do in-depth interviews to try to figure out how are people innovating, what do they view their incentive structure as. So I'll go ahead and stop there and take questions. Questions? Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your informative talk, Professor. This was very interesting as a student who is heading into China soon. I have a question regarding the case of in-home and elder care that you have demonstrated to us. Northeast Asia I think is having this similar population inverse pyramid crisis. And I'm wondering how effective this measure will be. In other words, is this solution really a sustainable one? Because even though it may be covering the 92% of the entire elderly population, if the population continues to grow and the budget from the working population doesn't rise at the same time, then doesn't that mean it's just it's a temporary measure that cannot be sustained into time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Tom's question is about the sustainability of this. So if we were to think about the central government adopting this and saying, okay, this is our elder care policy, is it really sustainable? And should other countries going through the same demographic shift look to China for a model? And I would argue that I think that it is a sustainable policy, although it's more complex maybe than a comprehensive care model. So basically what the government is saying is that we're going to see a shift over time of government resources being used for elder care versus family resources. And the way that we're going to do this then is we're still going to have nursing homes for the disabled or people who need that level of care, but then all other care is going to be delivered either through the community centers or through in-home care. And so I think what they're thinking is the most sustainable part of this is not necessarily the type of care that's being offered, but the targeted nature of care. So if it is too expensive and maybe not very effective to have just one level of care, you need to create different types of care. In the United States, we see this from a market economy perspective, which is that the number of companies that have created these assisted living centers, right? Recognizing that not all people need an institution, right? That other people simply need to have a little bit of assistance, maybe with transportation. And so I think that China's using that model, but they're very distrustful of simply opening up their market to these US companies. So there are these companies, there's a few US companies actually that are really active in China, including in Shanghai, that are creating assisted living apartments. And so we do see that kind of care as well. But I think the model is going to be lots of different types of care delivered by lots of different people, so NGOs, private firms, as well as the government, and that the government is basically seeing itself as the manager of that process and the one who is paying for the service to be delivered. So in that way, I think that you could look to China as a model in saying that if you're in a certain situation where you can't have a comprehensive solution and you have to have something that's piecemeal, that this is a way that you can manage the process. Yes.
Actually, the bottom-up structure of reform reminds me of in some people would attribute the reform and opening up to a village-level reform that happened in Anhui province.
Right.
Some people would say that it's that lower-level reform which gave the upper-level leaders the idea of what they should do. I find this point really interesting. And I also find the argument about Chinese systems meritocracy really interesting, because there are a lot of people, they have incentives to do things because they want to be promoted. And how effective would this incentive be? Because like, as we know, like in China, there are a lot of people because they want to be promoted. So they would like implement a lot of different experiments or projects because they want to see some progress. But sometimes those projects are really dumb, or because they want to see like immediate results. So that some of the projects are not really popular. And would you argue that this meritocracy, like how effective is this?
I think the answer is both that it is effective and it isn't. So one reason that I like to see this sort of bottom-up innovation is that it avoids something like the Great Leap Forward, right? So if you have policy innovation that becomes a pet project of the president of China, you find that local level officials aren't willing to say that it's not working. They say, yes, it's working, and they try to change the numbers around and do anything that they can to show, yes, your policy is brilliant and it's working. And so I think that a way of avoiding that sort of excess that led to a famine, right, is to have innovation that's done from the bottom up, because if it's not working, these government officials can't escape, right? They live there. Their wives work in the community and their children go to the schools. So they live in these communities, they're embedded in these communities, and I think they're less likely to engage in something that's completely destructive. If people are starving, I don't think that you can really escape social anger there. But I also think that you're absolutely right that this sort of career incentive can also lead to something that I call in my book face innovation, which is innovation just for the sake of innovation, just to show that you're doing something, but without anyone investing the actual resources or the political will necessary to make it successful. And so Joseph Fewsmith, who I cited in this talk, he has a book out called The Limits of Political Reform. Or The Logic and Limits of Political Reform, I think is his title. And he finds the same thing. He looks at all of these experiments with democracy, and he finds that as soon as the leader who championed them leaves office, is transferred to another position, that the reforms stop. And so he argues that this type of innovation really isn't sustainable unless the central government picks it up and makes it a national law. And so I think that maybe as a way to get at the happy medium of trying to find policies that are socially optimal but are also sustainable are the examples that I've been looking at, which is trying to pick reforms that have diffused across most provinces, if not all, in China. So this way we can look at a bottom-up process of reform that's really responsive to local needs, but at the same time we can also look at something that's clearly sustainable. So that's how I'm trying to get around it, but I absolutely agree that both of those problems exist. Yeah, Elizabeth?
I wanted to ask, I'll try to ask them quickly two questions. One is, if I understand you correctly, in your case study, it's actually a nonprofit group that came up with the idea. So you're describing to us bottom up, not with just within the bureaucracy, but bottom up in the sense that there's an entryway for nonprofit groups and other social actors to get an idea into the system, which is really interesting. I wanted to say about that. And the other question is, have you thought about the careers of the people who whether it paid off for them to adopt this particular policy, because the way that it spread, it suggests that at least for several of these people must have really been rewarded very nicely.
Yes, they were. And we haven't been able to do this in any sort of systematic way, but this is part of our grant application as well, which is that a colleague of ours has created this database. Right now, you really can't use it. It's just an Excel sheet that he created. But what we put in our budget that we would like to do is to use this information and create our own database that would correspond to these policy experiments, so that we could see what the outcome is as far as were they rewarded. I don't know how important it is, though, that every case is rewarded at the same level, because learning is also about perception rather than just empirics. And so I think that also if some of these cases are really, really high profile, that they tend to stick in the collective memory even more so than every single case. But we do think that that's an important thing, and what we want to do, we want to do surveys and interviews with local government officials to find out from them who they think the exemplars are, but then we also want to have some sort of empirical record. The question, though, about the NGOs, yes, so you know that my first love of working in China is really about the burgeoning civil society community in China. And so a lot of the reforms that I look at are coming from civil society. So the plastic bag ban in China that was pioneered by the Nature Conservancy in Yunnan, Those are some of the different policies that I look at, and this group was a domestic group that had created migrant schools for children of migrants, and then this was another one of their policies. And so these policies, I think, are really important because, you know, as I argue in my book about civil society in China, we don't expect to see that kind of social action and social participation in an authoritarian system. You know, the idea that the Nature Conservancy can help change national level laws in a country like China, I think is something that most of us don't normally think of. But I'm finding that there are some pretty high profile cases as well as an increasing number of cases of this happening, and I think that oftentimes it's because of the technical nature of different laws, and that these civil society groups who have access to international networks of scientists and researchers are able to say, okay, you have a problem, and we have the research and a ready-made policy already written out for you that we're going to give to you, and then you can adopt it. So one interview that I did in Yunnan, when I was asking about this plastic bag ban and why government was sponsoring this, especially since it came from an outside, you know, NGO, the Nature Conservancy, the guy looked at me and he said, so this is the head of their Environmental Protection Bureau. He looked at me and he said, 6 months ago, my job was with the local government, but I was doing waste management. And they decided that waste management and the environment were close enough, that was going to be my new job. And he said, so when they told me that I had to write some sort of, you know, environmental bill about dealing with the pollution associated with lots of tourism, I had no idea what to do. And so the Nature Conservancy said, we have all of these programs, we have these policies written, and we also have demonstration sites set up. So we'll give you all of this. And he said, you know, he has 3 people in his office, including himself. So that's why he eventually ended up using that policy. So I think that there are a lot of spaces inside the Chinese political system that allow for that sort of bottom-up process. It's just not in the formal system. Yeah,
Well, this is really great research and a fabulous presentation of work in progress. It's so clear. Just applaud the way you're presenting it.
thank you.
Yeah, I have 2 questions, 3 questions. One's theoretical and two are empirical.
Mm-hmm.
And the first theoretical question is really, I wanted you to say a little bit more about the difference between your learning explanation and experimentation under hierarchy. Because experimentation under hierarchy says the center initiates, and it selects the experiments it wants to see
Right.
diffused throughout the country. Is your learning explanation simply saying that the center is not initiating, but it's still selecting or sanctioning the diffusion of the results? That's
Sort of, in a way. So you're definitely correct that
no, just one.
yeah. So my explanation is that the central government is not initiating these experiments. That local government officials are doing this on their own terms. But my argument is also that in many cases they're also not picking the winners. So that the central government is actively telling local government officials, we don't want to see that type of innovation, but they continue to do it because it works so well, and then other people adopt those. And so their idea is that if it solves the problem, it's successful innovation and will be recognized at some point, even if right now the central government is saying, we don't want you to do that.
Okay, well that leads nicely into the empirical questions.
Good.
Okay, so 2 things. What's your most telling evidence that the process of diffusion takes place through learning rather than center selection or approval? Is it the GPS data, you know, the regional continuity? From that we can sort of infer that there's some imitation going on? Is that the main evidence?
Yeah.
And the other real question is, do you have an example of a local official, and the poster child for your explanation, who got promoted to the inner circle from the bottom of innovation? Whose individual story vindicates your learning explanation?
Yes. So first of all, I did begin with using GIS, and I did different overlays of the maps.
Not GPS, GIS.
Yeah, GIS. And so, yeah, I consulted heavily with the geography department and went to the lab with all the other students, and it was a very humbling process. And basically what I did is I used the maps and the overlay, so it is possible to do statistical analysis inside inside of GIS. It was not something that I wanted to do. And also a lot of my colleagues were saying that they also do their statistical analysis separately. And so what I was really using the maps for is to put the overlays of, percentage of the population, GDP, those sorts of measures. And I was trying to find patterns that way so that I could identify the different characteristics of early adopters versus late adopters. And what it basically did, which I didn't have in this presentation, is it showed me the cases that I need to go and start my interviews. So obviously you want to go to Shanghai, right? It's like the first adopter. That was the easy case. But what about the other cases? And so as a political scientist, the way I would normally do this is I would create a chart and I would put all the characteristics in that I think matter, and then I would try to choose, different cases. And what I did instead is I used GIS to show me where the pattern wasn't the same, but we still saw an early adopter. So for example, in the northeastern part of China, in Heilongjiang province, this is an area that didn't have a high elderly population. It also isn't a wealthy area. It's not a coastal area. And they were one of the early adopters, the first 5 adopters. And so I wouldn't have found that case if I had done my normal methods instead of using GIS. And so I think it's very effective for political science at picking up on trends because it's visual and you can see it. It sort of jumps out at you. Like you would have to be an idiot to miss this case. But I don't think that I would have found it if I had done a chart, right? So I found it to be incredibly effective. And then what I did is, once I could see what these patterns are, and I had a little bit of learning, I was able then to say, well, how would I measure these things and how would I see if they're significant? And that's then when I built out this database and I put all of this information into Stata and used a Cox hazard model. And the reason that I was using, first of all, in this literature for policy adoption, everyone uses these event history analyses just because they show you the likelihood of adoption each year. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to use the time dummies so that I could see if the central government was the single most important predictor, what should have happened is those years should have been significant. And so those time dummies would have been significant, and I could have seen that that was the impact that they were having. But I didn't find any statistical significance for the time dummy years, so 2006 and 2012. So in addition to a lot of other sources of sort of triangulation to come up with these answers, but in addition to all the other sources that I was using, the statistical analysis showed or gave me evidence that I could say, yes, this is not playing a large role in this particular case. But again, I'm going to test it in different policy areas, and so it might prove to be more important maybe in areas of economic reform, like we see from the literature.
And the poster child?
Oh, the poster child. Well, so there are poster children that have gotten promoted quickly, and Eric Lee has a great article. I think he did it for either, I think it was for foreign policy. But I have a copy of it if anyone would like it. And basically he outlines this career trajectory of this meritocracy approach, right? And what he's pointing to in these cases are the innovators, and he explains their innovation. If you would have asked me this 2 years ago, I would have said, Guo Xilai is the poster child of innovation. And he innovated around environmental issues in Dalian. So for anyone who's gone to Dalian, it's an amazingly green city. So when you go to the grocery store, the lights are all off and each aisle lights up as you walk down it, sort of like Target in the United States. And if you're in a public building, like in the museums, and you approach the escalator waits until you get within a certain distance and then it starts operating. And so having all of these sorts of things adopted has made Dalian one of the most environmentally friendly cities in China. And this was all done by Guo Xilai. Now, he was a little too successful at this strategy and really scared a lot of people. So my advice would be to local government officials is you want to have the Dalian example, but then you should stop innovating at that point. You don't want to keep innovating. So what he did then is he moved to his next, so he was promoted, and he became the governor/mayor of Chongqing. It's a city province. And what he did there is he also innovated around a new model of economic reform, sort of a shareholder socialism or shareholder communes, right? He wanted to create sort of a modern red capitalism. And that innovation became pretty terrifying for a lot of people because basically they saw this resurgence of Mao, right? And it was very scary for a lot of people. And so at this point, we might say, oh, well, he's not a poster child, but I would argue that actually he still really is. If you talk to local officials in China, they'll still tell you, Guo Xilai was a great politician, right? He was a great official. He just maybe pushed in an area that was too sensitive for the older members of the party who still remembered Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution and the purges of the party. So politically, he became dangerous, but I would still say that he's a poster child. He was promoted with such a fast trajectory. The next promotion, so he went from 1, 2, 3, only holding 3 government positions before he was going to be in the Central Committee. He would have definitely been in the running to be the next president.
Let's take maybe one more.
One more question?
Yes, thank you so much for a great talk and really enjoyed it. It reminds me a lot of the discussion that we were having, who's actually leading.
Right.
But I was wondering about, the experiments with social insurance and, Medicare. I know it's in place, but
Right.
that seems like it would be because that can't be an issue, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering, what is the center regional, kind of correlation there?
Right.
They're doing that in places, but how is, what's the impetus? I mean, I understand what actually is in like Asian population, people don't have healthcare and it's
Right.
corruption in the healthcare system, but, and discontent, therefore, right? But what's the actual?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question because this gets at a technical issue that we're going to have to deal with in our research. There's actually a recently graduated PhD student, John Mishuda, who worked with Kevin O'Brien at Berkeley, and he is actually teaching somewhere close. Anyway, I'm hoping to bring him to campus. I think University of Pennsylvania, but I'm hoping to bring him to campus to talk about his research because he finds exactly that, which there are certain issues that are really resistant to bottom-up policy change just because they have to be national solutions. So he looks a lot at food and drug safety. So this is something that might have to be a national level policy change and can't really be done in any sort of effective way at the local level. They just don't have the capacity to do something like that. Plus they're fighting really entrenched interests such as state-owned enterprises that might, in the political hierarchy, actually be above them. So they can't really tell these managers, okay, you need to stop putting lead in, these different products. So I definitely think that there are issues like that. With my research, I've been focused on issues where you can see that sort of local experimentation. And I would say that healthcare probably it could fall in either category, right? So if you want any sort of comprehensive reform, it is going to have to be in some way coordinated by at least the provincial level governments, but probably the national government. That said, you do still see a lot of policy experimentation because each province wants to be the one who solves the healthcare problem. And so, for example, in some areas, in Yunnan and Sichuan, for example, you saw that in rural areas they created these cooperatives, right, where you basically sold coupon books to the farmers and the central government paid for a third of it, the local government paid for a third of it, and then the individual family paid for a third of the coupon book. So basically it was subsidized healthcare, just like Medicaid would be. And so that was one reform that was tried. In Shanghai, what they did is they basically let U.S. insurance companies go into Shanghai and offer private insurance. So Shanghai is trying a U.S. model or a Swiss model, right, of private healthcare. And then in other areas, like in Beijing, you basically see it's basically Medicare or a comprehensive single-payer system. So you see in these different areas that there are these experiments, but I completely agree with you that there's only so much that these experiments can do before the central government's going to need to intervene. And the problem is that I think that they're just really unsure about which one to pick, because all of them have their dangers. And they know that they can't afford a comprehensive system everywhere. So right now they're putting it in certain cities, but that creates this rural-urban divide that we see in China that's so problematic, where the cities are first world cities, but the countryside, sometimes you don't even have electricity or running water. And so this is a really difficult thing for the government to decide. Basically, they're going to have to pick one of these plans and implement one of these plans, but which one?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.